Okay, good morning. Thank you all for joining us for this month's edition of CECL Coffee Talk. Certainly your opportunity to submit any questions. Just again, a couple of reminders on the format. You can certainly use the chat and Q&A features in Zoom to submit a question. You will be muted, but we will take those throughout presentation or depending on where we are in a slide, we'll monitor that throughout the presentation today. My name's Sean O'Brien, the president of QuickRate, but more importantly, we have two important people on the presentation today. Steve Huntington, who's our director of analytics here at QwickAnalytics. Steve, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Like to see all those faces out there. My name is Steve Huntington. I'm the director of analytics here at QwickAnalytics, and I've spent my entire career working with community financial institutions in everything from strategic planning and capital planning to M&A and valuation and model building and maintenance. I've been working with Sean for about a decade now to bring all those thoughts to bear in the QwickAnalytics environment here. And full disclosure, I'm on the East Coast, and so I just switched from coffee to tea. I know it's a coffee talk. I don't want this whole thing, hopefully you don't think it's all built on a lie, but just wanted everyone to be aware of that.
Thank you very much, Steve. And more importantly, today we even have a guest. Josh Bowen from Warren Averett's going to join us. Josh, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Thanks, Steve. I'm Josh Bowen. I'm a member in our financial institutions group here at Warren Averett. I actually sit in Montgomery, Alabama. So I actually made mention to Sean and Steve earlier. I don't want to feel like a fraud because I don't have coffee. But in South Alabama right now, if you drink coffee, you become like Frosty the Snowman. So I do have water, Steve. I don't have the tea. So I guess I'm going full unleaded this morning. So
fair enough.
But definitely a privilege to be here with everybody today. I do work the majority of the last, I guess, gosh, I'm getting old, Sean. Like I start thinking back and it's like back in the 1900s, but I've been working strictly with financial institutions for many years now. Get goosebumps to read about any and all things financial institutions. So I'm a bit of a nerd as well. I do have the privilege of being able to provide multiple presentations throughout the Southeast, and it's always a privilege to be on a panel or discussing anything, especially CECL, right? That's all something gives us all goosebumps. And then just kind of a fun fact, I am an avid auto racing fan. So it doesn't matter if it's NASCAR, Indy, or F1. And matter of fact, I'm trying to put up some money to see if I can watch Steve and Sean run after these are over with to see who's actually the fastest. So any type of competitive racing, I'm a fan.
I had a bet on myself until I ruptured my Achilles a couple of years ago, and now all bets are off from that perspective.
I would probably still put my money on Steve. As you can see, Josh and Steve both have a full head of hair, are much younger, high gray face and bald head. So I'm putting my money on Steve easily in that race. But glad to have Josh on the presentation today. You can already see he's lightening things up for us. We thought it would be great to, as we've tried to throughout the coffee talks, sprinkle in some additional qualified and capable resources, and Josh is certainly that. So you just don't simply have to listen to Steve and me month after month. So we're really proud to have Josh on the presentation today. Again, just a reminder, you are muted, so please use the Q&A box and the chat function. And we will, like I said, monitor those throughout the presentation today. Again, I think one of the reasons, the inspirations behind the coffee talks is we know that many of you are in different stages of your CECL or kind of adoption and understanding. So we wanted to make sure we gave our users and potentially new users and subscribers an opportunity to learn a little bit more about CECL, to more importantly submit any questions regardless of where you are in the process, and that we could either address them ourselves or bring in experts like Josh, to assist and give a better response to some of the questions that you have. So we will, again, continue to host these throughout the end of the year and into next year. And again, hopefully we'll assist you both with not only using our CECL solver, but just your understanding of CECL. So typically we understand that there are many of you on who are already subscribers, but there are some who may be new. So Steve, if you want to maybe just touch on the CECL solver real briefly.
Yeah, just real briefly, for those who aren't familiar, our CECL Solver tool heavily utilizes the weighted average remaining maturity methodology for CECL with some elements of snapshot open pool methodologies as well. Our entire tool lives in online in an interactive environment, which gives us a lot of benefits and efficiencies we can get from that. We start with the call report segmentation that we can get from your Form 5300s that everyone files each quarter. And that allows us to pretty much, when you first log in, we've already got a perfect historical picture of your charge-offs, recoveries, and balances by segment going all the way back in time. And the same thing for your peers as well. The benefits of using our tool is you spend the vast majority of your time in CECL where we think it should be spent, in the subjective parts of it, right? The reasoning and justification behind our qualitative factor adjustments, any economic assumptions that we're making, and then adjusting the historical experience for what our best expectations of losses and reserves necessary to cover them are going forward. So you don't spend a huge amount of time endlessly reconciling and re-reconciling accounts in order to get an actionable and defensible CECL solution. On the next slide, since the tool is built in an interactive environment, you get to save scenarios with a click of a button. You save a bunch of scenarios over time that you can access online, so that you can build a repository of what your CECL analysis showed over time and track how it's changing, right? As we go through this year and into next year, it's not just important at any one time to see where your ACL is coming out versus your old school incurred loss methodology, ALLL calculation, but how that's changing. Was that discrepancy $1 million 6 months ago and now it's 500,000? Is it going to continue decreasing over time? And is your day one adjustment going to be negligible? All these things will help you get prepared for day one and then day two and after next year. And another thing that we make sure that we do throughout the tool in various different areas as a best practice is to allow you spaces to make all the notes that you need to make, right? Whether you're justifying a specific assumption that you make, whether you're just building a narrative around your historical experience and why you think it needs to be adjusted going forward. There's lots of spaces for you to make all the notes at the segment level as you go through the tool, and they will be invaluable when you get to an audit, when you get to an exam, or even just when you get to next quarter. And you want to look back and remind yourself what you were thinking last quarter when you made the specific adjustments and assumptions that you made. Next slide, Sean. Just something else that we added a couple months ago for all of our users, since we were gathering all the financial data publicly available on every credit union in the country. We've got a wealth of information outside of just credit information from a CECL perspective. And so we thought we'd provide some ways to start sharing that data too. So now all of our CECL users have access to seeing some just financial mapping reports and financial reports on their credit union or on any other credit union in the country, where you can, pull up all the credit unions in your, if you're in NCUA peer group 5, right? The 100 to $500 million credit unions in California. And you're curious, well, who are those other 100 to 500 ones that I'm comparing myself to? On the next slide, Sean, is a tool that you can utilize now, where you can just sort by all the credit unions that are in your peer group and in your region or state, and then get a general idea of what they look like financially. And so we thought that those would be a beneficial add to the tool, and so we added them.
Great, thanks, Steve. We got a question
Sure.
already. How many organizations are going live with CECL in January 2023 versus later in 2023 when their next fiscal year begins? Any benefit to one versus the other? So I don't have definitive data. I would say anecdotally, I believe the majority of our credit unions are on calendar years. And so they'll be adopting, day one will be, January 1st. Steve, I don't know if you have anything to add, or Josh, I'd love to get your, take on that as well.
Yeah, I'm going to defer directly to Josh on this.
Yeah, so I think what we'll see is it's going to be day one of their beginning fiscal year that they're required to adopt CECL. So I definitely think for many credit unions out there, it will be January 1, 2023. But again, if their year end's different, then you would follow the first day of your fiscal year end.
Great. And Josh, maybe, I know we're going to touch on this in a little bit, but maybe we just get to that right now since the question came in. Can you just talk about the year-end measurement, or when their fiscal year would end, and then that day one accounting, and then the first quarter kind of transition?
Yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately or fortunately, for credit unions and any financial institution out there, we have these fun things called call reports and have to deal with those things. And Steve gets, he gets goosebumps on those because he's the data analysis analytics guy. And so we have those reporting interim requirements that go into effect. And so for credit unions, you're going to have to adopt that based on your first quarter call report of your first fiscal year. And so that's a bit of a game changer out there for financial institutions. And I will say, just so that everybody feels a little bit better, maybe, but CECL actually impacts all companies out there with trade receivables. Just we're the ones taking it on the chin in the credit union and financial institution world. And so, but yeah, essentially your day one accounting is going to be adopting the model, and then you're going to have a change in your allowance, which will be your accumulated credit losses going forward. And then you'll apply that to your capital in your year of implementation. And fortunately, regulators have provided some regulatory relief on how that transitions into your capital or your equity, your net worth. And so all that to say, the first year is really not going to be that overly complex, because it will go against your retained earnings, your undivided earnings. But going forward, it'll be just like we anticipate, and it's what we've seen in years past.
Great.
So go ahead, John.
I had a follow-up question, Steve, so you go ahead.
No, I would just clarifying. So on day one, if you calculate, let's say you have 1 million in ALLL, and on December 31st, and on January 1st, you do a calculation for CECL, and it comes in at 1.2 million. On January 1st, you'll take $200,000 from your undivided profits and transfer it in the balance sheet directly to your reserve to get that 1 million up to the CECL or ACL of 1.2 million, and vice versa too, right? Because people always ask, are we allowed to have a decrease? And I'll tell you what the answer, but I want to hear your take on that. It says there's nothing in CECL that requires higher or lower or anything, right? So if you have $1 million and CECL's coming up with 800,000 and you're comfortable with it and your auditors are comfortable with it, yeah, on day one, you'll take $200,000 from your reserve and put it right into your retained earnings. And then on day two, it'll be just like it always has been. From then on, you're provisioning in the income statement for increases or decreases in your ACL.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And do we have expectations of seeing it from an audit standpoint? And I would even say from a regulatory standpoint, your ALLL dropping down to, as you implement CECL, probably not. Unfortunately, I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate. I'll give you the fortunate side of it first, I guess, because Sean's a positive guy. You can see it. He likes the good news first.
I do.
So the good news is that financial institutions are in a really good position right now, and that capital is really strong, right? And so the unfortunate side of that is we're entering into a forward-looking allowance approach or a model into a time of uneasiness in the economic environment. And so how does that blend? So what it would probably say, like just for me as a financial statement reviewer, if I saw where the allowance came down under CECL, one, red flags go up to say, are our economic and supportable forecasts looking forward, are those reasonable? And so it would create some opportunities from an audit standpoint of wanting to look more into that, or as an internal auditor to look more into some of those assumptions. But then it could actually create some thoughts of looking back to say many institutions may have been building up that allowance in anticipation for CECL, which is not GAAP either. But at the time of implementation, it's like, well, a whale almost type deal. So regulators aren't going to typically press you to reduce your ACL as they never have. And so they usually are in favor of having a strong allowance out there. But it will be some interesting times, because not just from a financial institution, credit unions, auditors, CPAs, regulators, we're all trying to understand this model that is very complex, probably the most significant accounting standard in the history of financial institutions. And to try to understand that, we've got some regulators that may be in their head for the last 30 years of doing regulatory work may say, well, the allowance should always be 1.5% or 1%. And the reality is that those days are over when it comes to CECL, because it is much more complex and it's much more individualized. And so it would essentially, if you look at the model, it's going to be kind of like a surgeon going in with a scalpel and surgically doing his or her deal in surgery. And that's going to be how the CECL model works. Every portfolio is different. We should be working to make the model our own. And Steve and Sean will probably dive into a lot of other discussions about assumptions and all that we'll talk about that will allow you to surgically make it your own. And so it's good to compare to peers. We've got this to Sean and Steve can talk about some of their tools on comparing to peer data. But at the end of the day, you may be at 75 basis points where your peer could be at 150 basis points, and it may be completely acceptable as long as your documentation is supporting that calculation.
So we have a couple of follow-up questions. We have a credit union who's planning to adopt early prior to their fiscal years. And so the two questions are, one, their regulators have been asking them to reduce their ACCL over the years. And then, and then they're asking, there's no issues with adopting early, correct?
No, I would say congratulations. You're one of the few that would adopt early. So I don't know, in the South, we would say, bless your heart. So yeah, congratulations on that.
All right, so good. Yeah, so again, I mean, I would agree. We typically don't see credit unions adopting early, or institutions of even banks adopting early, but as Josh pointed out, no issues there.
They're special situations, right? We worked with some de novo institutions who are just out of the gates now, and they're thinking, should I be building an old ACCL methodology that I can use for 4 months, only to then immediately go to CECL, or should I just start with CECL? And certainly in that situation, it makes sense to start with CECL. And we've had a handful of institutions like yours who have, they want to reset the conversation with their auditors or their examiners when it comes to reserves. Let's say they've been fighting the good fight and losing that fight with their examiner as far as their reserve level and the incurred loss methodology for years. And this allows them an opportunity to say, hey, we're going to this methodology, we're going to CECL, this is what it shows. It kind of resets that conversation to an extent. And we've seen people do that and be very comfortable with it. So it's not the norm, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with it.
No, and I would say, well, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I was going to say, there are many factors there, and really, like if you're in a good spot and you're ready to go, and there's no need to hold out. There's absolutely no reason for that. What we are seeing in practice, though, is that even for institutions that are ready to adopt CECL, even if it's a year early or a year and a half, because we have had many institutions that are ahead of the game, and we've got a lot that are behind the 8 ball too. But those that are ahead of the game and they feel good about their process, their internal controls are in place, and their auditors have looked at it, reviewed it, blessed it to some degree. The regulators are comfortable. There's absolutely no reason for that for you not to adopt early. But what we're seeing is that many will hold out because they want more options to run, or more opportunities to do parallel runs, just to kind of continue to refine it. And one thing that we've heard over and over from even from the publicly traded banks that had to adopt it much earlier is that the more parallel runs you can have, the better, because there's always this refinement. So from a financial standpoint, it's a great time to, if you wanted to early adopt and you're ready, it's a great time because capital levels are really good and could support it right now.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And again, I think, Brian, you're probably in the minority. I mean, I think the majority of credit unions are facing the challenge of, potentially having their reserve go up for CECL. So, again, you're kind of in a fortunate situation. So along the lines, those same lines, Nancy has a question. Do we need to have CECL in our December 31st call report that we fill out in January, or we'll start with the March 31 call report?
Yeah, it'll start with the March 31. So there's going to be a really fun month there in January where everyone has transitioned their brains to CECL, but they're still filling out a 12/31 call report that has to be using unless they decide to early adopt. And we might see some of that, Josh, just because in January everyone's got their internal accounting shifted over to this, but then they're going to have to produce a call report that looks like it had in the past and cannot take into account CECL at all, but when they're all ready to do it. So I think that's going to be a fascinating month in January. But yes, if you don't early adopt and you adopt as of January 1, your 12/31 call report that you're doing in January has got to have nothing to do with CECL.
Yeah, Josh, anything to add there? Because again, I think this is probably a question we're going to get a lot more here in the final quarter, as credit unions have potentially been running parallel and they don't want to have that issue at 12/31, as Steve just alluded to. What do you think, or what do you think we'll see with credit unions and that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll probably see a blended approach, would be my guess. I still don't think, I would say the majority probably would not have to adopt to the absolute like last hour.
Yeah,
would be my guess.
Yeah, agreed. So again, I think that's the thing, right? You'll still fill out your 12/31 using the ALLL and then adopt on 1, and then first quarter of 23, you'll make that new adjustment. Okay, question came in. Is there a recommendation for how often we should update our WARM calculation? So I'll take a swing at this, and Steve and Josh, you can certainly jump in. So again, I think what we've seen practically, I mean, again, theoretically, I don't think there's any requirement you want to be as accurate as possible. I think from a practical consideration, what we see oftentimes is for a lot of credit unions, your WARMs will not change, quarter to quarter that significantly. I think to Josh's earlier point, that's why, doing more parallel runs are going to be helpful. So you can see that you may find, if that's the case, that semi-annual will be enough. But I think we're certainly prepared for the credit unions where we are calculating the data. We will certainly do it quarterly, if not monthly, if necessary. But again, I think practically speaking, we see for many institutions that their WARMs just don't change dramatically or significant or materially quarter to quarter. Steve, anything to add there before?
No, I think it's trial and error. I think the standard requires that the WARM calculations for that methodology be current and accurate. And if you've tracked it for a number of quarters, if you're doing the work yourself, let's say, and it's taking you some time, and your WARM for a segment's going from 3.13 to 3.15 to 3.17 years over the course of 9 months, that change is not going to make any difference in the overall calculation. It's going to be a rounding error. And then you could justify doing it every 6 months. But I think it's all about making reasonable assumptions. And if you can prove that your WARMs are a rounding error of difference every quarter, then you could probably justify doing it less often.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think some of the interest rate environment could change that too. So if right now, all the loans that we're writing now, they have a little bit elevated rate, and if it continues to go up, that's going to impact, but really the biggest impact is going to be on that way down. So as rates go down, obviously prepayment speed assumptions are going to change. And so that weighted average calculation could change. And the ultimate question from an audit standpoint is it material? And so, and that's something that your financial institution is going to have to do an analysis to see if that's the case. My my thought is that most institutions will probably do it on at least a quarterly basis, because they want to ensure that the call reports are correct, and that and really that you're following your internal control structure and your policies. And so if your policy is in line where you're wanting to update that quarterly or needing to, then obviously you need to follow that quarterly.
And you can take it sort of not in pieces, but one of the, as Josh mentioned, one of the biggest assumption from a WARM is a mathematical calculation. The only big assumption that really matters for CECL that's built into that WARM calculation is a prepayment, a forward-looking prepayment assumption. Now, if your WARMs aren't changing quarter to quarter, but you want the ability to change your prepayment estimate next quarter because you've seen rates change, then our tool allows for that. If you're using our Excel-based WARM estimator tool, you can leave the WARM calculations the same and then just change your prepayment assumption and see how it affects the WARM, and use an updated one with a different prepayment assumption if that's the only thing that you think has materially changed.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Joe, we're going to get to your question. I'm going to take Sonia's next here, just because it was actually the next slide we were going to do. But her question was, some investments need to be reported in CECL. Does the tool have a place to report these, or would it only be recorded in the call report? Steve, you want to go ahead and take that one, since that's kind of our next slide.
So we do have a spot on the tool now for the held to maturity securities. I think Josh could maybe speak to why we're focused on just the held to maturity securities here from a CECL perspective, and less so the available for sale portfolio. But we added this just recently so that you would at least be able to see a summary of what your security portfolio looks like, and then have a space that works very much like the individually assessed loans, right? Where you have specific pools of securities, ones that do have risk of credit loss, and then you can estimate it here very much like you can the individually assessed loans tab for loans, and then that will flow through to the summary tab, which will add a separate ACL reserve for held to maturity securities. In practice, I think Sean and Josh will speak to the fact that in practice, there's not a whole lot of it for the majority of credit unions that we work with.
Yeah, so I agree with that, and I think the main thing is keeping in line, and Sean said this multiple times in these presentations, that we really have to focus on the credit impacts of held to maturity. So you're always going to have fluctuations in interest. It's that credit piece that we really want to focus on. And for many institutions, they actually are investing in bonds, and if there are held to maturity, those may be very, very much so backed by some type of government agency, like a Ginnie Mae type agency, that essentially your risk of loss is at zero, would be what most would recommend. And so there would be no particular impact on the held to maturity. So really focusing on the credit risk when it comes to CECL. On the available for sale securities, which I would say would be the majority of the investments out there in most portfolios, there's really no change whatsoever when it comes to CECL, except for the old bad word, the OTTI, the other than temporary impairments, that it will be going away. And so essentially, instead of having a hard write-off when we have an investment that meets the OTTI, now there will be an allowance instead, which actually, in my opinion, is better accounting anyway. And so that's the biggest change there.
Great. I'm going to go back a slide, Steve. We just had a question, I think, on something that was listed maybe potentially earlier regarding credit cards. So what's the theory behind the remaining estimated life? I see in the prior slide it's 1.5 years. If we have a strong delinquent policy for credit cards that would not let a credit card balance stay that long, but would charge it off, would that shorten the estimated life of the loan?
So let me just talk conceptually about WARMs, weighted average remaining maturities, and how they and how you deal with them in with a loan that does not have a stated contractual maturity date, right? So they have to be treated. You have to make some sort of assumption, because on CECL, we're estimating losses over the remaining lives of the assets. We have to somehow estimate the remaining life of your credit card portfolio as it stands today. We can't do it by taking stated contractual maturity dates and averaging between now and then for all the loans like we do for the majority of the portfolio. So we use payment data instead of contractual maturity dates, we look at recent payment data and current balances in order to get a proxy for it. So for example, if someone's got a $10,000 balance and they're making $500 principal payments every month, well, there's 20 months between now and when the balance would become zero. Now we have to make a universal assumption about no additional credit is extended. We look at the current balance today and say, hey, how many years until this balance would be zero if payments stay similar? And that's our proxy for a maturity date. And then we use that to calculate the WARM. Now, the only difference there is since we're using actual payment data, that already includes a prepayment estimate, right? Because prepayments are in people's payment data. So you don't overlay a very large prepayment assumption on top of your WARM calculation for credit card loans if you're using the payment data like I'm suggesting. Now, you would add a prepayment assumption on top of it if you expected prepayments to increase in the future from where they were in the past, right? Any difference in prepayments you'd want to put in there, but not a universal prepayment assumption like you would for the rest of the portfolio. The 1.5 that you see there was, just a random number that we plugged in for sample for this tool. We typically see pretty short weighted average remaining maturities for credit card portfolios. It depends on your credit union. If most of your customers are paying it off paying off the full balance every month, you're talking about extremely short average remaining lives. So it depends on the payment history of your customers. I hope that at least somewhat answers the question.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Steve. So then there's next question. I don't know if you can see it. CECL Solver seems to use the aggregate loan loss and the average loan balance to determine the expected future loss rate. Why not use the aggregate loan loss / aggregate loan balance or average loan loss / average loan balance?
So I think it's a confusion of calculation there, and I don't understand it. Like when you say when the question is divided by the aggregate loan balance. Well, loan balances don't aggregate over time. They are as of a point in time. The average loan balance, we use the aggregate loan loss over the whole lifetime divided by the average loan loss, but over the whole lifetime. So that's where it becomes apples to apples. When you're doing a net charge-off ratio, for example, a loss rate on any loan, let's say year to date, you're taking the total aggregate losses, income statement, losses divided by the average balance year to date. If we're trying to calculate a lifetime loss rate, we want to take aggregate losses over the lifetime divided by average balance over that lifetime. So I think that's where the confusion might be. And we're not taking the average balance on an annual basis as our denominator. Our numerator and our denominator are both over the entire length of the life of the loan. Aggregate added up for losses and averaged out for balance sheet items. So it becomes a multi-year net charge-off ratio, if that's what you want to think about it, right? From a conceptual standpoint.
Great. Thank you, Steve. The next question is, do we have a CECL policy guideline? And so I think in our resources tab, we don't necessarily have a policy guideline. I think what we've done up here in the top right, you can see there's a resources tab that contains a number of things, including references to presentations done around CECL, but we do have a kind of an implementation letter. We have a white paper. Steve, what else would you?
There is a user guide that's a PowerPoint type presentation user guide that takes you through the steps of what's on each tab of the tool, how to utilize it, some best practices, what the tool is showing you. So that is a user guide. We have a draft of an implementation letter. So I think what people are looking for a lot of times is help on the language for their, as they're changing their policies. And there is some policy type language you can get from our Word document template for the implementation guide. We're also working on some more guidance we can give you as far as potential policy language that you would certainly want to, as Josh would say, make your own. But we're going to add some more resources in there for some of that language and guidance over the next couple months. We've been aggregating it and getting it from a lot of our users who have been through audits and through exams where they've looked at this and thought about it.
And Josh, would you maybe this is something you can opine on, what would you see or what would you like to see as an auditor in a good CECL policy, or just something the credit union should adopt for their new process?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and nothing long. Maybe keep it less than 1,500 pages, something like that. So just kidding, obviously. Yeah, I think really just going through which the policies in credit unions and financial institutions in general are typically very well documented, very detailed. So I would definitely make sure that you would document all of your key impacts, your key areas of how you're calculating, what your controls are, how often you're calculating your ACL. You know, one resource that I would recommend is just to go and select some publicly traded bank financial statements and look through those disclosures, because all financial statements have to document their accounting policies, their significant accounting policies. And it's not going to be multi-page just on CECL per se, but go and look at maybe the year of adoption for some of those banks and see what those disclosures look like, what they read. And maybe it wouldn't be like a Chase or a B of A, but maybe a smaller community bank type publicly traded entity that may be a little bit closer to what your institution looks like. And look at their documentation in their disclosures, and that may be a good baseline to start with as well.
Well, that's a great idea. Appreciate that, Josh. Okay, Steve, let's kind of move on. We touched on the HTM securities. Just want to talk about the new QFactor detail page that we've been kind of discussing in the last couple of months, and should be ready here.
Yeah, well, I'd like to share that. Well, let's talk about this for 1 second generally, and then I'd like to share my screen, because we have it on the tool now in an internal version of our tool. We're going to make it live, I believe, next week. But I did want to show people not an Excel screenshot, but a real screen. Yeah. But just generally, the ask that we've had from a lot of our users was, you know, right now on our QFactors tab, we have a handful of columns, and the columns are mostly adjustments based upon environmental factors like economic data, and then the peer data that we give. And then kind of it's a bit of an open forum for, hey, all your other QFactors, you can simply add your own custom columns. But we wanted to re-emphasize the fact, and I'd like Josh to speak on this too, that QFactors are not a new concept under CECL. And the types of QFactors that you should at least that you should at least consider in any reserve analysis are not new. They've been part of the interagency guidance for a long time. And so it made sense to us. Why don't we just go ahead and add each of these in as a potential QFactor? And so they're just part of the tool by default. If one of them doesn't apply to any part of your portfolio, you can get rid of it. But we thought we'd add a little bit more there, as opposed to putting the onus on the burden on you guys to add all these columns individually when a lot of you are already using these things. So that was the concept of it. And Josh, if you want to speak to that while I pull up my screen.
Yeah, I think QFactors just in general, just think about it as whatever documentation you've had in the past is going to blow up. So basically that's kind of the documentation there. You know, the good thing about CECL is that it creates flexibility, which from an accounting, from a CPA standpoint, and I would even say from a regulatory standpoint, we don't like a lot of times, because we like bright lines. We want to say, this is how you do it. You tell me how to do it, and I'll do it exactly how you say. And CECL is not that way. And most accounting standards have been trending to go away from bright lines and follow more of a principles-based approach. And so as a result, giving you more flexibility on creating and documenting your allowance to how it better fits your institution. That means that there's going to have to be more documentation and supportable evidence of what QFactors are supporting your allowance, as well as what those forecasts will be as well. And so, you know, going back even to the historical qualitative factors that have been documented since like Moses was kicking rocks, those QFactors now, we're going to have to make sure that we're really documenting those over each individual pool. And whereas we may used to include an economic qualitative factor that's kind of broad and across the entire portfolio, those are going to have to be surgically tuned up to whatever pool that you're looking at. So if you're looking at your call codes, for instance, if you're looking at consumer loans, those economic factors may very well be different than, say, a commercial pool that's being documented. And so even from the economic data, and obviously the Fred through St. Louis gives great data. There's a lot of free resources on economic data. I would recommend reaching out, looking at potentially some of your local universities. A lot of times their business schools will have great economics department or business departments that provide local economic data. Obviously your local or your state level probably provides good economic local data as well, your state labor departments and so forth. And so each of those may very well need to be different. And so it's just going to take a lot of time to document all of those Q factors.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Steve, you want to take it?
Yeah, so this is the, you'll notice instead of the blue bar up top, there's a big orange bar that just lets me know that this is not a live version of the tool yet. But on the QFactors tab, as you can see now, you'll have the same columns you're used to, the peer experience, economic conditions, other external factors. But now instead of just a custom user text where you can add your own custom QFactors, all these ones suggested qualitative factors from the interagency guidance are kind of are pre-built in here. And you can make adjustments throughout your portfolio to them. If let's say you've had absolutely no change in your portfolio mix in the recent past and you don't want to make any adjustments there, you say that one just doesn't apply to me at all, you just remove it. So you have some more control over the Q factors, yet those suggested ones are there for everybody to see, to know that you've considered them. And for the audit trail and everything else. And again, when you're ready, when you export it and you export the tool here, all the columns that exist will certainly go into the export. That's what took the upgrade, the enhancement to the tool the longest time. It doesn't seem like it's rocket science to add some additional columns into the tool, but we have to consider how they view on a page when you're PDFing it versus exporting to Excel and all those fun little formatting things. And we want it to be seamless and clean and attractive. So that's why we take our time even on some of these smaller enhancements.
Fantastic. All right, so Steve, I'm going to take it back here.
Yes.
And get back to the PowerPoint. Okay. Steve just kind of went through this. So again, we'll be looking for that enhancement very shortly. And then, again, I think this we've kind of alluded to already, but just again, kind of exactly what happens on day one for the accounting of CECL.
Probably retirement for some,
Yeah.
Sean. At least that's what I've heard from some people. Day one would be retirement. But no,
I'm already training replacements. I have customers who call and say, I am retiring in approximately January 1st, but I have my replacement here. Can you help get them up to speed? That's okay. And if you're the replacement on the call, then welcome to the show. The water's warm.
Yeah, we've covered this, Sean. I don't know if there's much more to add here. One thing I will say is day one is approaching very quickly, and we've alluded to that earlier. If you're in a model right now that's highly complex or something, I would say, don't necessarily be afraid to look at something more simplistic if you feel like that's the need. Originally, when we started looking at CECL, the thought was we were going to have 645 different models for each pool, and we had to figure out all the loss given default calculations, and it's just kind of all across the board. And granted, a lot of that discussion was relevant because the institutions that were having to adopt this were very complex, large, publicly traded banks, and so that unfortunately was the data that we were receiving. And many, including even the Federal Reserve, put out tools like Scale, which I know really doesn't impact credit unions, but there became a push of becoming a little bit more simplistic so that we don't have to worry about highly complex modeling. And so if you're in that stage, I would say that I have clients that have models in place that are calling me still saying, I think we may look at going to something a little bit more simplistic, looking at the warm method instead, because it better suits our institution. We're just not that complex. And so there's a little bit of time to do that if you feel necessary. But I will say, just simplicity is maybe better at times. You know, so Shelly and I, she's my wife, we just had like all these shrubs pulled up, and our landscaper, he said, well, what do you want? I said, less is more. That's what we want. And so that's the approach we went. And I think that's a good way of thinking about it too. Definitely need to make sure that it's well documented, controls are in place, the model fits your institution, major assumptions are well documented, but no need to get overly stressed that you have to have this super duper like complex model in place to be compliant both from a regulatory and a GAAP standpoint.
Awesome. That's perfect. Well said, Josh. All right. Prepayment assumptions are another area, again, that can be a little bit of a slippery slope. But Steve, do you want to talk a little bit about what we've
Yeah. We've touched on this for the last few weeks a lot, but we had a lot of questions and requests from our users to help with some more guidance on prepayments, because as Josh was mentioning, this is one of the big assumptions that's built into whether you're using the WARM method or any other methodology, since it's really based upon CECL is based upon estimating losses over the remaining lives of the assets or the pools. Getting a handle on what that likely remaining life is a huge assumption. And the first, which is simply just calculating a weighted average remaining life, which is simply math, and then making a large assumption on over top of that, what prepayment speed do we expect going forward? How do we take this mathematical WARM and bring it down based upon estimated prepayments? If you're having trouble, getting the data to accurately calculate just the math portion of the WARM, it can seem overwhelming to try to then somehow come up with some sort of long-term longitudinal study on prepayment speeds historically. And then even if you do that, that's still only half the battle, because they're not asking you for your historical prepayment speed. They're asking you for your estimate of future prepayments on this pool going multiple years into the future, where simply nobody knows, right? We're going to share with you some information right here that shows that prepayment speeds can vary wildly over time. And so we wanted to give you some basics, a starting point, right? That's defensible for prepayment. So I would say we reached the end of the internet multiple times trying to find good data, and it was hard to come by. The best data comes from, for mortgage loans, because of the mortgage-backed securities industry has a vested interest in doing these types of work. So the FHFA actually apparently publishes a prepayment monitoring report every quarter. It's hidden deep on their site and it's hard to find, but we found it, and they do update it frequently. And it has some really good data from a mortgage perspective on prepayment rates over time. And they are annualized conditional prepayment rates, which is what we want from a WARM perspective, right? And it's for all Fannie Freddie mortgages, average for all coupons and terms. So it's a good long-term average annual prepayment rate trend to use as a starting point. It has varied. On the next slide, we'll show it to you. This value here on page 5 of that report is the best summary one to look at. It's varied from as low as 6-7% all the way up to 35% plus annual prepayment rate on mortgage type loans across the country less than a year ago. It's certainly coming down now that the interest rate environment is increasing, but it suggests a long-term average prepayment rate in that 15 to 20% range. Now, some of you might look at this and say, well, it was 35% a year ago, but now it's down to below 15%. And so should I just use 15%? Well, 15% now, but do you expect the interest rate environment to continue on its upward path over the next 2, 3, 4 years, over the remaining life of your loans going forward? And that's harder to say. Over the next 6 months, yeah, probably. Over the next 2 years, more questionable. So I think starting with a longer term average, admitting we don't know too far into the future, and taking a long-term average as your starting point until you have some better data is, we feel like, is pretty defensible. We wanted to give you guidance from that perspective. So this is that guidance. Now, all the rest of your portfolio, outside mortgage related loans, even sketchier industry data, less available, but we did find a couple things that we thought might help. We found it on the next slide, Sean, the Federal Reserve's, the term asset-backed securities loan facility, the TALF program, which started a decade ago at this point, I guess. Their website still updates a lot of information that the Fed uses in some of their assumptions. As of a year and a half ago, they were still updating it. And the data they had on prepayment rates for other types of loans, we thought could be very helpful. Now, a lot of other types of loans, they don't do prepayment rates on annualized conditional CPRs. They do just what they call an ABS, an absolute prepayment speed, which is a monthly prepayment calculation, which you would have to annualize, which you can do. So a 1.5% monthly would be 18% annual prepayment rate for auto loans, for example. So I think this is helpful, and it just so happens to be that it ends up falling in that 15 to 20% range for most of these types, and that's not that different from what we're seeing on the mortgage side. So we feel like we have some better data now to defend somewhere in a 15 to 20% prepayment assumption in different parts of the portfolio, unless you have better data. I know our Excel-based warm estimator tool by default just has a 10% prepayment rate plugged in there. We wanted to start certainly conservative, right? And allow you the ability to update that, increase that prepayment rate if you want to A, be more aggressive, or B, just follow what the industry data that you have or historical data that you have is actually showing you. Josh, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's great, Steve. And it's very interesting times that we're in right now, because we are in rising rate environments, which means that loans probably won't be prepaying too quickly right now. But how long will that stay? I mean, in the interest rate risk world, we're really probably paying attention more to rising rates and declining rates, because with the economic uncertainty, will we be in a recession that actually causes rates to fall within the next couple of years, maybe in the next year even? Who knows how that plays out. So I will say though, Steve, that one thing to think about when it comes to all of these major assumptions, whether it be prepayment speeds, economic forecasts, as we apply these major assumptions into the model, is to ensure that we are thinking about performing some type of sensitivity analysis over those assumptions as well. One thing to think about is if unemployment were to go up double digits like it did in 2020, how does that impact the model? Are our assumptions too sensitive? Are they not sensitive enough? And by performing a sensitivity analysis over those major assumptions, that'll give us a better idea of which assumptions are really those key assumptions. They're functioning as key assumptions in the model, and it'll give us a little bit more comfort that our assumptions are reasonable within our expected ACL calculation.
Thank you. And a question about the slides that I just shared with everybody about prepayment speed guidance. We're adding that to our resources button on the tool. I think it's going to go up there this weekend. We're just waiting for my my team to programming team to get it uploaded there. But it'll be like just a 4-page or 5-page PDF with links to the actual regulatory sites where you can get updated data. And we will update actually we'll put up the entire prepayment monitoring report as a resource as well, and we'll update that every quarter. But if you don't see it there on Monday, it'll be up there sometime during the week next week.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. You got ahead of me in my typing on the screen is the question. So I appreciate you jumping in and sharing everybody having to see my hands type that answer out. Okay, so I think we're at the point where we've kind of touched on everything we wanted to. Certainly, if there's any additional questions, we certainly would entertain them now. If not, we'll let you get back to your day. So let me just double check this one last time. We certainly appreciate all of you taking time for Coffee Talk this morning. Our next installment will be in September on the 16th at 11:30 Eastern. For those of you who may be new to CECL Solver and what we're doing here, we will have a demo, a webinar on August 31st, where Steve and Jason from our sales team will take you through just a kind of a walkthrough of the CECL Solver. If you have any questions in the interim and would prefer us to do something with your own data, you can email us at info@quickrate.com and we can schedule a time to take you through your data. So one last look here to see if there's any questions. I don't see any. So I certainly want to again thank you for your time today and showing up and asking questions. certainly, whoops, here we do maybe have one more. Nope, we got to thank you. So thank you very much. I appreciate that as always. We want to give a special thanks to Josh Pullen from Warren Averett for joining us today. He certainly elevated the conversation and appreciate his time. Thanks to Steve as always for his questions and commentary. And again, I think I got them all. More thank yous. I appreciate that. So again, Steve and Josh, any final words before we let everybody go?
I don't think so. So thanks again for allowing me to be a part of the discussions day. It's always a pleasure. And just stay diligent. The day one's almost here. After day one's over, hey, everybody, we'll all be sitting at the beach. So we'll be good to go.
Well, the more I talk about CECL every day, the more I feel like I need to switch back to coffee from the tea. So we'll see where the afternoon leads us.
Yeah, may need something stronger than coffee or tea by the afternoon. So
I don't know what, I have no idea what you could be referring to, Josh.
Well, on that note, everybody find whatever will make you work this afternoon and have a great day and a great weekend. And we'll look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.